Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is The Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. I'll be with you for the next 2 hours. YouTube gods be willing, of course. All right, ladies and gents, today is Friday, 16th day of January, year of our Lord, 2020. Today's topic, going to be doing a mashup. I'm going to be doing it the first half of the show. I'm going to be performing a seance, and we're going to summon forth the spirit of Alfred Marshall, and he's going to discuss with us his principles of economics via a crack team of spiritual crack team of media, spiritual media. And so then we're going to do that in the first half. We're going to have that little seance. We're going to talk with Alfred Marshall. He's going to talk about principles of economics. Then second half, going to do a banishing ritual. I'm going to send Alfred Marshall's spirit straight back to hell where he belongs. And in the second half of the big show, we're going to take some calls. And if you'd like to call in, be a part of the big show, that number is 657-383-1825. That's 657-383-1825. I won't be taking calls during the first half. During the second half, we're going to be taking some calls, and also I'm going to be sharing management tips and strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, more management tips and strategies. So you guys will definitely want to stay tuned for today's big show. It's going to be awesome. During the first half, though, as always, those of you watching on YouTube, I'm going to be giving you a special treat as well. That's right. I'm going to be doing a 50-year-old cripple guy, 51-year-old. I'm 51 years old now. 51-year-old inspirational, motivational, 51-year-old cripple guy instructional fitness video. I'm going to be working out here. So those of you who are regulars, listeners to the show know I've been away for a while, but I've still been working. It's a long story, but I didn't really vanish. I was still doing my thing. I was just doing it in other places. But I have made significant gains in my workouts. I beefed up the weight training a little bit. You may notice. I was using the 10-pound therapeutic bar. I've now graduated to a 12-pound therapeutic bar. That's right. And I was only using 8-pound dumbbells. Now I'm up to 15-pound dumbbells. However, I think what I'm probably going to be doing in this workout is I'm going to start off with 15-pound dumbbells. Do that to exhaustion. Then go down to 10-pound dumbbells. I'll be doing bench press, flies, military press. Okay, and then after I get done with the dumbbells, then I will hit that 12-pound therapeutic bar. And it's going to be wild. You guys will see. Those of you who are regulars will see what I'm talking about. But I have made pretty good gains in that area. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this seance started. Whoa, shoot. Alfred, are you there? Alfred, please speak to us, brother. Share with us your principles of economics. Alfred, are you there?
Known on supply. And again, when summing up his theory of value, Book 3, Chapter 16, Section 1, he says, "From this it appears that demand and supply govern the fluctuations of prices in all cases, and that the permanent values of all things, of which the supply is determined by any agency other than that of free competition, but that under the regime of free competition, things are, on the average, exchanged for each other at such values and sold for such prices as afford equal expectation of advantage to all classes of producers, which can only be when things exchange for one another in the ratio of their cost of production. And on the next page, speaking of commodities which have a joint cost of production, he says, since cost of production here fails us, we must resort to a law of value anterior to cost of production and more fundamental, the law of demand and supply. Jevons, page 215, referring to this last passage, speaks of the fallacy involved in Mill's idea that he is reverting to an anterior law of value, the law of supply and demand. The fact being that in introducing the cost of production principle, he has never quitted the law of supply and demand at all. The cost of production is only one circumstance which governs supply and thus indirectly influences value. This criticism seems to contain an important truth, though the wording of the last part is open to objection. If it had been made in Mill's time, he would probably have accepted it, and would have withdrawn the word anterior as not expressing his real meaning. The cost of production principle and the final utility principle are undoubtedly component parts of the one all-ruling law of supply and demand. Each may be compared to one blade of a pair of scissors. When one blade is held still and the cutting is effected by moving the other, we may say with careless brevity that the cutting is done by the second. But the statement is not one to be made formally and defended deliberately. Perhaps Jevons' antagonism to Ricardo and Mill would have been less if he had not himself fallen into the habit of speaking of relations which really exist only between demand, price, and value, as though they held between utility and value, and if he had emphasized, as Cournot had done, and as the use of mathematical forms might have been expected to lead him to do, that fundamental symmetry of the general relations in which demand and supply stand to value, which coexist with striking differences in the details of those relations. We must not indeed forget that, at the time at which he wrote, the demand side of the theory of value had been much neglected, and that he did excellent service by calling attention to it and developing it. There are few thinkers whose claims on our gratitude are as high and as various as those of Jevons, but that must not lead us to accept hastily his criticisms on his great predecessors. It seemed right to select Jevons's attack for reply, because in England, at all events, it has attracted more attention than any other. But somewhat similar attacks on Ricardo's theory of value have been made by many other writers. Among them may specially be mentioned Mr. MacLeod, whose writings before 1870 anticipated much both of the form and substance of recent criticisms on the classical doctrine of value in relation to cost by Professors Walras and Karl Menger, who were contemporary with Jevons, and Professors von Braunmark and Weiser, who were later. The carelessness of Ricardo with regard to the element of time has been imitated by his critics, and has thus been a source of twofold misunderstanding. For they attempted to disprove doctrines as to the ultimate tendencies, the causes of causes, the causal causantes of the relations between cost of production and value, by means of arguments based on the causes of temporary changes and short-period fluctuations of value. Doubtless, nearly everything they say when expressing their own opinions is true in the sense in which they mean it. Some of it is new, and much of it is improved in form. But they do not appear to make any progress toward establishing their claim to have discovered a new doctrine of value, which is in sharp contrast to the old, or which calls for any considerable demolition as distinguished from development and extension of the old doctrine. Ricardo's first chapter has been discussed here with sole reference to the causes which govern the relative exchange values of different things, because its chief influence on subsequent thought has been in this direction. But it was originally associated with a controversy as to the extent to which the price of labor affords a good standard for measuring the general purchasing power of money. In this connection, its interest is mainly historical, but reference may be made to an illuminating article on it by Professor Hollander in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, 1904. End of Appendix I. Appendix J of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix J. The Doctrine of the Wages Fund. At the beginning of last century, great as was the poverty of the English people, the peoples of the continent were poorer still. In most of them, population was sparse, and therefore food was cheap, but for all that they were underfed, and could not provide themselves with the sinews of war. France, after her first victories, helped herself along by the forced contributions of others. But the countries of Central Europe could not support their own armies without England's aid. Even America, with all her energy and national resources, was not rich. She could not have subsidized continental armies. The economists looked for the explanation, and they found it chiefly in England's accumulated capital, which, though small when judged by our present standard, was very much greater than that of any other country. Other nations were envious of England and wanted to follow in her steps, but they were unable to do so, partly, indeed, for other reasons, but chiefly because they had not capital enough. Their annual income was required for immediate consumption. There was not in them a large class of people who had a good store of wealth set by, which they did not need to consume at once, and which they could devote to making machines and other things that would aid labor, and would enable it to produce a larger store of things for future consumption. A special tone was given to their arguments by the scarcity of capital everywhere, even in England, by the growing dependence of labor on the aid of machinery, and lastly, by the folly of some followers of Rousseau who were telling the working classes that they would be better off without any capital at all. In consequence, the economists gave extreme prominence to the statements, first, that labor requires the support of capital, i.e., of good clothes, etc., that have been already produced, and secondly, that labor requires the aid of capital in the form of factories, stores of raw material, etc. Of course, the workman might have supplied his own capital, but in fact he seldom had more than a little store of clothes and furniture, and perhaps a few simple tools of his own. He was dependent for everything else on the savings of others. The laborer received clothes ready to wear, bread ready to eat, or the money with which he could purchase them. The capitalist received a spinning of wool into yarn, a weaving of yarn into cloth, or a plowing of land, and only in a few cases commodities ready for use, coats ready to be worn, or bread ready to be eaten. There are no doubt important exceptions, but the ordinary bargain between employers and employed is that the latter receives things ready for immediate use, and the former receives help towards making things that will be of use hereafter. These facts the economists express by saying that all labor requires the support of capital, whether owned by the laborer or by someone else, and that when anyone works for hire, his wages are, as a rule, advanced to him out of his employer's capital. Advanced, that is, without waiting till the things which he is engaged in making are ready for use. These simple statements have been a good deal criticized, but they have never been denied by anyone who has taken them in the sense in which they were meant. The older economists, however, went on to say that the amount of wages was limited by the amount of capital, and this statement cannot be defended. At best, it is but a slovenly way of talking. It has suggested to some people the notion that the total amount of wages that could be paid in a country in the course of, say, a year, was a fixed sum. If by the threat of a strike, or in any other way, one body of workmen got an increase of wages, they would be told that in consequence other bodies of workmen must lose an amount exactly equal in the aggregate to what they had gained. Those who have said this have perhaps thought of agricultural produce, which has but one harvest in the year. If all the wheat raised at one harvest is sure to be eaten before the next, and if none can be imported, then it is true that if anyone's share of the wheat is increased, there will be just so much less for others to have. But this does not justify the statement that the amount of wages payable in a country is fixed by the capital in it, a doctrine which has been called the vulgar form of the wages fund theory. It has already been noticed, Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 7, that Mill in his later years, under the combined influence of Comte, of the socialists, and of the general tendencies of public sentiment, set himself to bring into prominence the human, as opposed to the mechanical, element in economics. He desired to call attention to the influences which are exerted on human conduct by custom and usage, by the ever-shifting arrangements of society, and by the constant changes in human nature, the pliability of which he agreed with Comte in thinking that the earlier economists had underrated. It was this desire which gave the chief impulse to his economic work in the latter half of his life, as distinguished from that in which he wrote his essays on unsettled questions, and which induced him to separate distribution from exchange, and to argue that the laws of distribution are dependent on particular human institutions, and liable to be perpetually modified as man's habit of feeling and thought and action pass from one phase to another. He thus contrasted the laws of distribution with those of production, which he regarded as resting on the immutable basis of physical nature, and again with the laws of exchange, to which he attributed something very much like the universality of mathematics. It is true that he sometimes spoke as though economic science consisted chiefly of discussions of the production and distribution of wealth, and thus seemed to imply that he regarded the theory of exchange as part of the theory of distribution. But yet he kept the two separate from one another. He treated of distribution in his second and fourth books, and gave his third book to the machinery of exchange. Compare his Principles of Political Economy, Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 1, and Chapter 16, Section 6. In doing this, he allowed his zeal for giving a more human tone to economics to get the better of his judgment, and to hurry him on to work with an incomplete analysis. For, by putting his main theory of wages before his account of supply and demand, he cut himself off from all chance of treating that theory in a satisfactory way, and in fact he was led on to say, Principles, Book 2, Chapter 11, Section 1, that wages depend mainly upon the proportion between population and capital, or rather, as he explains later on, between the number of the laboring class who work for hire and the aggregate of what may be called the wages fund, which consists of that part of circulating capital which is expended in the direct hire of labor. The fact is that the theories of distribution and exchange are so intimately connected as to be little more than two sides of the same problem, that in each of them there is an element of mechanical precision and universality, and that in each of them there is an element dependent on particular human institutions, which has varied, and which probably will vary from place to place and from age to age. And if Mill had recognized this great truth, he would not have been drawn on to appear to substitute, as he did in his second book, the statement of the problem of wages for its solution, but would have combined the description and analysis in the second book with the short but profound study of the causes that govern the distribution of the national dividend given in his fourth book, and the progress of economics would have been much hastened. As it was, when his friend Thornton, following in the wake of Long, Cliff, Leslie, Jevons, and others, convinced him that the phrases in his second book were untenable, he yielded too much, and overstated the extent of his own past error and of the concessions which he was bound to make to his assailants. He said, Dissertations, Volume 4, page 46, there is no law of nature making it inherently impossible for wages to rise to the point of absorbing not only the funds which he, the employer, had intended to devote to carrying on his business, but the whole of what he allows for the private expenses beyond the necessaries of life. The real limit to the rise is the practical consideration how much would ruin him or drive him to abandon the business, not the inexorable limits of the wages fund. He did not make it clear whether this statement refers to immediate or ultimate effects, to short periods or long, but in either case it appears untenable. As regards long periods, the limit is put too high, for wages could not rise permanently so as to absorb nearly as large a share of the national dividend as is here indicated. And for short periods, it is not put high enough, for a well-organized strike at a critical juncture may force from the employer for a short time more than the whole value of his output, after paying for raw materials during that time, and thus make his gross profits for the time a negative quantity. And indeed, the theory of wages, whether in its older or newer form, has no direct bearing on the issue of any particular struggle in the labor market. That depends on the relative strength of the competing parties. But it has much bearing on the general policy of the relation of capital to labor, for it indicates what policies do, and what do not, carry in themselves the seeds of their own ultimate defeat, what policies can be maintained, aided by suitable organizations, and what policies will ultimately render either side weak, however well organized. After a while, Carnes, in his leading principles, endeavored to resuscitate the wages fund theory by expounding it in a form which he thought would evade the attacks that had been made on it. But, though in the greater part of his exposition he succeeded in avoiding the old pitfalls, He did so only by explaining away so much which is characteristic of the doctrine that there is very little left in it to justify its title. He states, however, page 203, that the rate of wages, other things being equal, varies inversely with the supply of labor. His argument is valid in regard to the immediate result of a sudden great increase in the supply of labor. But in the ordinary course of the growth of population, there results simultaneously not only some increase in the supply of capital, but also greater subdivision of labor and more efficiency. His use of the term varies inversely is misleading. He should have said varies for the time at least in the opposite direction. He goes on to derive an unexpected consequence, that an increase in the supply of labor, when it is of a kind to be used in conjunction with fixed capital and raw material, would cause the wages fund to undergo diminution as the number who are to share it is increased. But that result would follow only if the aggregate of wages were not influenced by the aggregate of production, and in fact, this last cause is the most powerful of all those which influence wages. It may be noticed that the extreme forms of the wages fund theory represent wages as governed entirely by demand, though the demand is represented crudely as dependent on the stock of capital. But some popular expositors of economics appear to have held at the same time both this doctrine and the iron law of wages, which represents wages as governed rigidly by the cost of rearing human beings. They might, of course, have softened each of them and then worked the two into a more or less harmonious whole, as Carnes did later, but it does not appear that they did so. The proposition that industry is limited by capital was often interpreted so as to make it practically convertible with the wages fund theory. It can be explained so as to be true, but a similar explanation would make the statement that capital is limited by industry equally true. It was, however, used by Mill chiefly in connection with the argument that the aggregate employment of labor cannot generally be increased by preventing people, by protecting duties or in other ways, from satisfying their wants in that matter which they would prefer. The effects of protective duties are very complex and cannot be discussed here, but Mill is clearly right in saying that in general, the capital that is applied to support and aid labor in any new industry created by such duties must have been withdrawn or withheld from some other, in which it gave, or would have given, employment to probably about the same quantity of labor which it employs in its new occupation. Or, to put the argument in a more modern form, such legislation does not prima facie increase either the national dividend or the share of that dividend which goes to labor. For it does not increase the supply of capital, nor does it in any other way cause the marginal efficiency of labor to rise relatively to that of capital. The rate that has to be paid for the use of capital is therefore not lowered. The national dividend is not increased. In fact, it is almost sure to be diminished. And as neither labor nor capital gets any new advantage over the other in bargaining for the distribution of the dividend, neither can benefit by such legislation. This doctrine may be inverted, so as to assert that the labor required to give effect to capital in a new industry, created by protective duties, must have been withdrawn or withheld from some other, in which it gave, or would have given, effect to probably about the same quantity of capital as in its new occupation. But this statement, though equally true, would not appeal with equal force to the minds of ordinary people. For as the buyer of goods is commonly regarded as conferring a special benefit on the seller, though in fact the services which buyers and sellers render to one another are in the long run coordinate, so the employer is commonly regarded as conferring a special benefit on the worker, whose labor he buys, though in the long run the services which the employers and employees render to one another are coordinate. The causes and consequences of this pair of facts will occupy us much at later stages of our inquiry. Some German economists have argued that the resources with which the employer pays wages come from customers, but this appears to involve a misapprehension. It might be true of an individual employer if the consumer paid him in advance for what he produced, but in fact, the rule goes the other way. The consumer's payments are more often in arrear and merely give deferred command over ready commodities in return for ready commodities. It may be admitted that if the producer could not sell his goods, he might not be able for a time to hire labor, but that would only mean that the organization of production was partially out of gear. A machine may stop if one of its connecting rods gets out of order, but that does not mean that the driving force of the machine is to be found in the rod. Nor again is the amount which the employer pays as wages at any time governed by the price which consumers do pay him for his wages, though it generally is largely influenced by his expectations of the price they will pay him. It is indeed true that in the long run and under normal conditions, the prices which consumers do pay him and those which they will pay him are practically the same. But when we pass from the particular payments of an individual employer to the normal payments of employers generally, and it is really only with these latter that we are now concerned, consumers cease to form a separate class, for everyone is a consumer. The national dividend goes exclusively to consumers in the broad sense in which wool or a printing press is said to go into consumption when it is transferred from the warehouse or engineering works in which it is rested to a woolen manufacturer or printer, and these consumers are also the producers, that is, the owners of the agents of production, labor, capital, and land. Children and others who are supported by them, and the government which levies taxes on them, do but expend part of their incomes for them. To say, therefore, that the resources of employers generally are ultimately drawn from those of consumers generally is undoubtedly true. But it is only another way of saying that all resources have been parts of the national dividend, which have been directed into forms suitable for deferred instead of immediate use. And if any of them are now applied to any other purpose than immediate consumption, it is in the expectation that their place will be taken, with increment or profit, by the incoming flow of the national dividend. The first fundamental proposition of Mill's is closely connected with his fourth, viz., that demand for commodities is not demand for labor, and this again expresses his meaning badly. It is true that those who purchase any particular commodity do not generally supply the capital that is required to aid and support the labor which produces those commodities. They merely divert capital and employment from other trades to that for the products of which they make increased demand. But Mill, not contented with proving this, seems to imply that to spend money on the direct hire of labor is more beneficial to the laborer than to spend it on buying commodities. Now there is a sense in which this contains a little truth. For the price of the commodities includes profits of a manufacturer and middleman, and if the purchaser acts as employer, he slightly diminishes the demand for the services of the employing class and increases the demand for labor as he might have done by buying, say, handmade lace instead of machine-made lace. But this argument assumes that the wages of labor will be paid, as in practice they commonly are, while the work is proceeding, and that the price of the commodities will be paid, as in practice it commonly is, after the commodities are made. And it will be found that in every case which Mill has chosen to illustrate the doctrine, his arguments imply, though he does not seem to be aware of it, that the consumer, when passing from purchasing commodities to hiring labor, postpones the date of his own consumption of the fruits of labor. And the same postponement would have resulted in the same benefit to labor if the purchaser had made no change in the mode of his expenditure. Throughout the whole discussion of the national dividend, the relations in which the kitchen apparatus of a hotel and those of a private house stand to the employment of cooks have been implicitly treated as on a like footing. That is to say, the capital has been regarded broadly. It has not been limited to mere trade capital, but a little more may be said on this subject. It is indeed often thought that, though those workers who have little or no accumulated wealth of their own have much to gain by an increase of the capital in that narrower sense of the term, in which it is nearly convertible with trade capital that supports and aids them in their work, yet they have little to gain from an increase of other forms of wealth not in their own hands. No doubt there are a few kinds of wealth the existence of which scarcely affects the working classes, while they are directly affected by almost every increase of trade capital. For the greater part of it passes through their hands as implements or materials of their work, while a considerable part is directly used or even consumed by them. It seems, therefore, that the working classes must necessarily gain when other forms of wealth become trade capital and vice versa. But it is not so. If private people generally gave up keeping carriages and yachts and hired them out from capitalist undertakers, there would result a smaller demand for hired labor. For part of what would have been paid as wages would go as profits to a middleman. It may be objected that if other forms of wealth take the place of trade capital on a large scale, there may be a scarcity of the things needed to aid labor in its work, and even of those needed to support it. This may be a real danger in some Oriental countries. But in the Western world, and especially in England, the total stock of capital is equal in value to the aggregate of the commodities consumed by the working classes during many years, and a very small increase in the demand for those forms of capital that minister directly to the laborer's needs, relatively to other forms, would quickly bring forward an increased supply of them, either imported from some other part of the world or specially produced to meet the new demand. There is therefore no necessity to trouble ourselves much on this score. If the marginal efficiency of labor is kept high, its net product will be high, and so will, therefore, its earnings, and the constantly flowing stream of the national dividend will divide itself up in corresponding proportions, giving always an adequate supply of commodities for immediate consumption by the workers, and assigning to the production of those commodities an adequate stock of implements. When the general conditions of demand and supply have decided what part of the national dividend the other classes of society are free to spend as they will, and when the inclinations of those classes have decided the mode in which they will distribute their expenditure between present and deferred gratifications, etc., it matters not to the working classes whether orchids come from the private conservatories or from the glass houses which belong to professional florists, and which are therefore trade capital. End of Appendix J. Appendix K of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix K. Certain kinds of surplus. We have next to make some study of the relations in which different kinds of surplus stand to one another and to the national income. The study is difficult and it has little practical bearing, but it has some attractions from the academic point of view. While the national income or dividend is completely absorbed in remunerating the owner of each agent of production at its marginal rate, it yet generally yields him a surplus which has two distinct, though not independent sides. It yields to him as consumer a surplus consisting of the excesses of the total utility to him of the commodity over the real value to him of what he paid for it. For his marginal purchases, those which he is only just induced to buy, the two are equal. But those parts of his purchases for which he would gladly have paid a higher price rather than go without them, yield him a surplus of satisfaction, a true net benefit which he, as consumer, derives from the facilities offered to him by his surroundings or conjuncture. He would lose this surplus if his surroundings were so altered as to prevent him from obtaining any supplies of that commodity, and to compel him to divert the means which he spends on that to other commodities, one of which might be increased leisure, of which at present he does not care to have further supplies at their respective prices. Another side of the surplus which a man derives from his surroundings is better seen if he is regarded as producer, whether by direct labor or by the accumulated, that is, acquired and saved material resources in his possession. As a worker, he derives a worker's surplus through being remunerated for all his work at the same rate as for that last part, which he is only just willing to render for its reward, though much of the work may have given him positive pleasure. As a capitalist, or generally as owner of accumulated wealth in any form, he derives a saver's surplus through being remunerated for all his saving, that is, waiting at the same rate as for that part which he is only just induced to undergo by the reward to be got for it. And he generally is remunerated at that rate, even though he would still have made some savings if he had been compelled to pay for their safekeeping and had reaped a negative interest from them. These two sets of surpluses are not independent, and it would be easy to reckon them up so as to count the same thing twice. For when we have reckoned the producer's surplus at the value of the general purchasing power which he derives from his labor or saving, we have reckoned implicitly his consumer's surplus too, provided his character and the circumstances of his environment are given. This difficulty might be avoided analytically, but in no case would it be practically possible to estimate and add up the two series. The consumer's surplus, the worker's surplus, and the saver's surplus, which anyone is capable of deriving from his surroundings, depend on his individual character. They depend in part on his general sensibility to the satisfactions and dissatisfactions of consumption and of working and waiting severally, and in part also on the elasticity of his sensibilities, that is, on the rates at which they change with an increase of consumption, of work and of waiting, respectively. Consumer surplus has relation in the first instance to individual commodities, and each part of it responds directly to changes in the conjuncture affecting the terms on which that commodity is to be had. While the two kinds of producer surplus appear always in terms of the general return, and the conjuncture gives to a certain amount of purchasing power. The two kinds of producer surplus are independent and cumulative, and they stand out distinct from one another in the case of a man working and saving things for his own use. The intimate connection between both of them and consumer surplus is shown by the fact that, in estimating the weal and woe in the life of a Robinson Crusoe, it would be simplest to reckon his producer surpluses on such a plan as to include the whole of his consumer surplus. A great part of a worker's earnings are of the nature of a deferred return to the trouble and expense of preparing him for his work, and there is therefore a great difficulty in estimating his surplus. Nearly all his work may be pleasurable, and he may be earning a good wage for the whole of it. But in reckoning up the balance of human weal and endurance, we must set off against this much effort and sacrifice endured by his parents and by himself in past time. But we cannot say clearly how much. In a few lives there may be a balance of evil, but there is some reason to think that there is a balance of good in most lives, and a large balance in some. The problem is as much philosophical as economic. It is complicated by the fact that man's activities are ends in themselves as well as means of production, and also by the difficulty of dividing clearly the immediate and direct or prime cost of human effort from the total cost, and it must be left imperfectly solved. The case is in some respects simpler when we pause to consider the earnings of material appliances for production. The work and the waiting by which they have been provided yield their own workers' and waiters' surplus just mentioned, and in addition a surplus or quasi-rent of the excess of total money returns over direct outlay, provided we confine our attention to short periods only. But for long periods, that is, in all the more important problems of economic science, and especially in the problems discussed in this chapter, there is no distinction between immediate outlay and total outlay. And in the long run, the earnings of each agent are, as a rule, sufficient only to recompense at their marginal rates the total sum of the efforts and sacrifices required to produce them. If less than these marginal rates had been forthcoming, the supplies would have been diminished, and on the whole, therefore, there is in general no extra surplus in this direction. This last statement applies in a sense to land which has been but recently taken up, and possibly it might apply to much land in old countries, if we could trace its records back to their earliest origins. But the attempt would raise controversial questions in history and ethics, as well as in economics, and the aims of our present inquiry are prospective rather than retrospective. Looking forward rather than backward, and not concerning ourselves with the equity and the proper limits of the present private property and land, we see that that part of the national dividend which goes as earnings of land is a surplus in a sense in which the earnings from other agents are not a surplus. To state from the point of view of this chapter a doctrine which has been discussed at length in 5, 8 through 11, all appliances of production, whether machinery or factories with the land on which they are built, or farms, are alike in yielding large surpluses over the prime cost of particular acts of production to a man who owns and works them, also in yielding him normally no special surplus in the long run above what is required to remunerate him for his trouble and sacrifice and outlay in purchasing and working them. No special surplus as contrasted with his general workers' and waiters' surplus. But there is this difference between land and other agents of production, that from a social point of view, land yields a permanent surplus, while perishable things made by man do not. The more nearly it is true that the earnings of any agent of production are required to keep up the supply of it, the more closely will its supply so vary that the share which it is able to draw from the national dividend conforms to the cost of maintaining the supply, and in an old country land stands in an exceptional position, because its earnings are not affected by this cost. The difference between land and other durable agents is, however, mainly one of degree, and a great part of the interest of the study of the rent of land arises from the illustrations which it affords of a great principle that permeates every part of economics. End of Appendix K. Appendix L of Principles of Economics. This is a LibreVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix L. Ricardo's Doctrine as to Taxes and Improvements in Agriculture. Much has already been said about the excellence of Ricardo's thought and the imperfections of his expressions of it, and in particular notice has been taken of the causes which led him to lay down the law of diminishing return without proper qualifications. Similar remarks apply to his treatment of the influence of improvements and the incidence of taxes in agriculture. He was especially careless in his criticisms of Adam Smith, and as Malthus justly said, summary of section 10 of his Political Economy, Mr. Ricardo, who generally looks to permanent and final results, has always pursued an opposite policy in reference to the rents of land. It is only by looking to temporary results that he could object to Adam Smith's statement that the cultivation of rice or of potatoes would yield higher rent than corn. And Malthus was perhaps not far wrong when he added, practically, there is reason to believe that, as a change from corn to rice must be gradual, not even a temporary fall of rent would take place. Nevertheless, in Ricardo's time it was of great practical importance to insist, and it is of much scientific interest even now to know, that in a country which cannot import much corn, it is very easy so to adjust taxes on cultivation, and so to hinder improvements as to enrich the landlords for a time, and to impoverish the rest of the people. No doubt, when the people had been thinned by want, the landlords would suffer in pocket, but that fact took little of the force from Ricardo's contention that the enormous rise of agricultural prices and rents which occurred during his life was an indication of an injury to the nation beyond all comparison, greater than the benefits received by the landlords. But let us now pass in review some of those arguments in which Ricardo delighted to start from sharply defined assumptions, so as to get clear net results, which would strike the attention and which the reader might combine for himself so as to make them applicable to the actual facts of life. Let us first suppose that the corn raised in a country is absolutely necessary, i.e., that the demand for it has no elasticity, and that any change in its marginal cost of production would affect only the price that people paid for it, and not the amount of it consumed. And let us suppose that no corn is imported. Then the effect of a tax of 1/10 on corn would be to cause its real value to rise till 9/10 as much as before would suffice to remunerate the marginal dose, and therefore every dose. The gross corn surplus on every piece of land would therefore remain the same as before, but 1/10 being taken away as a tax, the remainder would be 9/10 of the old corn surplus. Since, however, each part of it would have risen in real value to the ratio of 10 to 9, the real surplus would remain unchanged. But the assumption that the demand for produce is absolutely inelastic is a very violent one. The rise in price would in fact be sure to cause an immediate falling off in the demand for some kinds of produce, if not for the staple cereals, and therefore the value of corn, i.e., produce in general, would never rise in full proportion to the tax, and less capital and labor would be applied in the cultivation of all lands. There would thus be a diminution in the corn surplus from all lands, but not in the same proportion from all, and since 1/10 of the corn surplus would be taken by the tax, while the value of each part of it would have risen in less than the ratio of 10 to 9, there would be a double fall in the real surplus. The diagrams on page 158 suggest at once translations of those reasonings into the language of geometry. The immediate fall would be very great under modern conditions in which pre-importation of corn prevents its real value from being much raised by the tax, and the same result would follow gradually, even in the absence of importation, if the rise in its real value diminished the numbers of the people, or, what is at least as probable, if it had had the effect of lowering the standard of living and the efficiency of the working population. These two effects would operate very much in the same way on the producer's surplus. Both would make labor dear to the employer, while the latter would also make real-time wages low to the worker. Ricardo's reasonings on all these questions are rather difficult to follow, because he often gives no hint when he ceases to deal with results which are immediate and belong to a short period relatively to the growth of population, and passes to those which are ultimate and belong to a long period in which the labor value of raw produce would have time materially to affect the numbers of the people, and therefore the demand for raw produce. When such interpreting clauses are to be supplied, very few of his reasonings will be found invalid. We may now pass to his argument with regard to the influence of improvements in the arts of agriculture, which he divides into two classes. A special scientific interest attaches to his treatment of the first, which consists of those improvements that I can obtain the same produce with less capital, and without disturbing the difference between the productive powers of the successive portions of capital, of course neglecting for the purpose of his general argument the fact that any given improvement may be of greater service to one particular piece of land than another. See above, Book 4, Chapter 3, Section 4. Assuming, as before, that the demand for corn has no elasticity, he proved that capital would be withdrawn from the poorer lands, and from the more intense cultivation of the richer lands, and therefore the surplus measured in corn, the corn surplus, as we may say, obtained by applications of capital under the most favorable circumstances, will be a surplus relatively to lands not so poor as those which were on the margin of cultivation before, and the differential productiveness of any two applications of capital remaining, by hypothesis unchanged, the corn surplus must necessarily fall, and of course the real value and the labor value of the surplus will fall much more than in proportion. Figure 40 shows a positive quadrant at which O is the origin. On the vertical axis, H and H prime, A and A prime are shown. On the horizontal axis, D prime and D are shown. There is a curve drawn from A prime to C prime, which lines up with H prime and D prime. There is another curve drawn from A to C, which lines up with H and D. This may be made clear by the adjoining figure, in which curve AC represents the return which the land of the whole country, regarded as one farm, makes to doses of capital and labor applied to it, these doses being arranged not in the order of their application, but in that of their productiveness. In equilibrium, OD doses are applied, the price of the corn being such that a return DC is just sufficient to remunerate a dose, the whole amount of corn raised being represented by the area AODC, of which AHC represents the aggregate corn surplus. We may pause to notice that the only change in the interpretation of this diagram, which is required by our making it refer to the whole country instead of a single farm, arises from our not being able now, as we could then, to suppose that all of the several doses of capital are applied in the same neighborhood, and that therefore the values of equal portions of the same kind of produce are equal. We may, however, get over this difficulty by reckoning the expenses of transporting the produce to a common market as part of its expenses of production, a certain part of every dose of capital and labor being assigned to the expenses of transport. Now, an improvement of Ricardo's first class will increase the return to the dose applied under the most favorable conditions from OA to OA prime, and the returns to other doses not in like proportion but by equal amounts. The result is that the new produce curve A prime C prime will be a repetition of the old produce curve AC, but raised higher than it by the distance A prime. If, therefore, there were an unlimited demand for corn, so that the old number of doses, OD, could be profitably applied, the aggregate corn surplus would remain the same as before the change. But in fact, such an immediate increase of production could not be profitable, and therefore an improvement of this kind must necessarily lessen the aggregate corn surplus. And on the assumption made here by Ricardo that the aggregate produce is not increased at all, only OD prime doses will be applied, OD prime being determined by the condition that A prime OD prime C is equal to AODC, and the aggregate corn surplus will shrink down to A prime H prime C prime. This result is independent of the shape of AC, and which is the same thing, of the particular figures selected for the numerical illustration which Ricardo used in proof of his argument. And here we may take the occasion to remark that numerical instances can, as a rule, be safely used only as illustrations and not as proofs, for it is generally more difficult to know whether the result has been implicitly assumed in the numbers shown for the special case than it is to determine independently whether the result is true or not. Ricardo himself had no mathematical training, but his instincts were unique, and very few trained mathematicians could tread as safely as he over the most perilous courses of reasoning. Even the acute logical mind of Mill was unequal to the task. Mill characteristically observed that it is much more probable that an improvement would increase the returns to capital applied to different classes of land in equal proportions than by equal amounts. See his second case, Political Economy, Book 4, Chapter 3, Section 4. He did not notice that by so doing he cut away the basis of Ricardo's sharply defined argument, which was that the change did not alter the differential advantages of different applications of capital. And though he arrived at the same result as Ricardo, it was only because his result was implicitly contained in the numbers he chose for his illustration. Figure 41 also shows a positive quadrant, with O as the origin. The horizontal axis shows D prime and D. The vertical axis shows H, K, H prime, A, and A prime. There is a curve drawn from A prime to C prime, which is very sharp. There is another curve drawn from A to C, which is also very, very sharp. There is a line drawn from H prime to C prime and up from D prime to C prime. There is another line drawn from H to C and down to D prime. The adjoining figure tends to show that there is a class of economic problems which cannot be safely treated by anyone of less genius than Ricardo without the aid of some apparatus, either of mathematics or of diagrams, that present as a continuous whole the schedules of economic forces, whether with regard to the law of diminishing return or to those of demand and supply. The curve AC has the same interpretation in this figure as in the last, but the improvement has the effect of increasing the return to each dose of capital and labor by 1/3, i.e., in an equal proportion and not by an equal amount. And the new produce curve, A prime, C primes, stands much higher above AC at its left end than at its right. Cultivation is restricted to OD prime doses, where the area A prime, OD prime C, representing the new aggregate product, is as before equal to AODC, and A prime, H prime, C prime is as before the new aggregate corn surplus. Now it can be easily proved that A prime, H prime, C prime is 4/3 of AKE, and whether this is greater or less than AHC depends upon the particular shape assigned to AC. If AC be a straight line, or nearly a straight line, both Mill's and Ricardo's numbers represented points on a straight produce line, A prime, H prime, C prime would be less than AHC, but with the shape assigned to AC in our figure, A prime, H prime, C prime is greater than AHC. And thus Mill's argument is, while Ricardo's is not, dependent for its conclusion on the particular shape assumed by them for the gross produce curve. Mill assumes that the cultivated part of a country consists of 3 quantities of land, yielding at an equal expense 60, 80, and 100 bushels, and then he shows that an improvement, which increased the return to each dose of capital by 1/3, would lower corn rents in the ratio of 60 to 26 2/3. But if he had taken the distribution of fertility in a country to be such that the land consisted of 3 quantities, yielding at an equal expense 60, 65, and 115 bushels, as is done roughly in our figure, he would have found that in that case the improvement would raise corn rents in the ratio 60 to 66 2/3. Finally, it may be noticed that Ricardo's paradox as to the possible effects of improvements on the rented land is applicable to urban as well as agricultural land. For instance, the American plan of building stores 16 stories high with steel frames and served with elevators may be supposed suddenly to become very efficient, economical, and convenient in consequence of improvements in the arts of building, lighting, ventilation, and the making of elevators. In that case, the trading part of each town would occupy a less area than now. A good deal of land would have to revert to less remunerative uses, and the net result might possibly be a fall in the aggregate site values of the town. End of Appendix L.
Part 1 of the Mathematical Appendix to Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2008. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Mathematical Appendix. Note 1. The law of diminution of marginal utility may be expressed thus. If U be the total utility of an amount X of a commodity to a given person at a given time, then marginal utility is measured by the differential of U over the differential of X multiplied by the change in X, while the differential of U over the differential of X measures the marginal degree of utility. Jevons and some other writers use final utility to indicate what Jevons elsewhere calls a final degree of utility. There is room for doubt as to which mode of expression is the more convenient. No question of principle is involved in the decision. Subject to the qualifications mentioned in the text, the square of the differential of U over the differential of X squared is always negative. Note 2. If M is the amount of money or general purchasing power at a person's disposition at any time, and mu represents its total utility to him, then the differential of mu over the differential of M represents the marginal degree of utility of money to him. If P is the price which he is just willing to pay for an amount X of the commodity which gives him a total pleasure U, then the differential of mu over the differential of M multiplied by the change in P equals the change in U. And the differential of mu over the differential of M multiplied by the differential of P over the differential of X equals the differential of U over the differential of X. If P dash is the price which he is just willing to pay for an amount X dash of another commodity which affords him a total pleasure U dash, then the differential of mu over the differential of M multiplied by the differential of P dash over the differential of X dash equals the differential of U dash over the differential of X dash. And therefore, the differential of P over the differential of X such that the differential of P dash over the differential of X dash is equivalent to the differential of U over the differential of X such that the differential of U dash over the differential of X dash. Compare Jevons' chapter on the theory of exchange. Every increase in his means diminishes the marginal degree of utility of money to him. That is, the square of the differential of mu over the differential of M squared is always negative. Therefore, the marginal utility to him of an amount X of a commodity remaining unchanged, an increase in his means increases the differential of U over the differential of X divided by the differential of mu over the differential of M, i.e. it increases the differential of P over the differential of X, that is, the rate at which he is willing to pay for further supplies of it. We may regard the differential of P over the differential of X as a function of M, U, and X, and then we have the square of the differential of P over the differential of M times the differential of X, always positive. Of course, the square of the differential of P over the differential of U times the differential of X is always positive. Note 3. Let P and P dash be consecutive points on the demand curve. Let PRM be drawn perpendicular to OX. And let PP dash cut OX and OY in capital T and lowercase t respectively, so that P dash R is that increment in the amount demanded which corresponds to a diminution PR in the price per unit of the commodity. Then the elasticity of demand at P is measured by P dash R over OM divided by PR over PM, i.e. by P dash R over PR times PM over OM, i.e. by TM over PM times PM over OM, i.e. by TM over OM, or by P capital T over P lowercase t. When the distance between P and P dash is diminished indefinitely, PP dash becomes the tangent, and thus the proposition stated on page 103 is proved. It is obvious a priori that the measure of elasticity cannot be altered by altering relatively to one another the scales on which distances parallel to OX and OY are measured. But a geometrical proof of this result can be got easily by the method of projections. While analytically it is clear that the differential of x over x divided by the negative of the differential of y over y, which is the analytical expression for the measure of elasticity, does not change its value if the curve y equals function of x be drawn to new scales, so that its equation becomes qy equals the function of px, where p and q are constants. If the elasticity of demand be equal to unity for all prices of the commodity, any fall in price will cause a proportionate increase in the amount bought, and therefore will make no change in the total outlay which purchasers make for the commodity. Such a demand may therefore be called a constant outlay demand. The curve which represents it, a constant outlay curve, as it may be called, is a rectangular hyperbola with OX and OY as asymptotes. There is some advantage in accustoming the eye to the shape of these curves, so that when looking at a demand curve, one can tell at once whether it is inclined to the vertical at any point at a greater or less angle than the part of a constant outlay curve which would pass through that point. Greater accuracy may be obtained by tracing constant outlay curves on thin paper, and then laying the paper over the demand curve. By this means, it may, for instance, be seen at once that the demand curve in the figure represents at each of the points A, B, C, and D an elasticity about equal to 1. Between A and B, and then again between C and D, it represents an elasticity greater than 1, while between B and C, it represents an elasticity less than 1. It will be found that practice of this kind makes it easy to detect the nature of the assumptions with regard to the character of the demand for a commodity, which are implicitly made in drawing a demand curve of any particular shape, and is a safeguard against the unconscious introduction of improbable assumptions. The general equation to demand curves representing at every point an elasticity equal to n is the differential of x over x plus n of the differential of y over y equals 0, i.e. xy to the power n equals c. It is worth noting that in such a curve, the differential of x over the differential of y
Thank you,
is
Alfred.
equal to the negative of c over y to the power n plus 1.
Thank you, Alfred.
That's it.
Thank you. All right. Now with that, we're going to perform the banishing ritual. We're going to send Alfred Marshall's spirit straight back to hell. Spirit be gone with ye, till I call ye forth again. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, time for the second half of the big show. We're going to be talking about management tips and strategies. That's right. So all together, this is a little mashup, a thing I like to call economic managing for competitive advantage. That's right. We're doing a mashup of Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics combined with Charlie Lamson's Management Tips and Strategies. All right, coming at you. And this is from, this is actually from an analysis I did of a book I read a while back, a couple months back, last year, at the end of last year. And that's on the blog, by the way. If you want to check it out, just go to charleslamson.blogspot.com and check that stuff out. And charleslamson.blogspot.com. Just go back to all the sections are divided into by time. They're divided by the years there. So you just go back to 2019 and check out November. I guess I started doing it in November of 2019. Worked through December, but that being said, we've got about a little under an hour left in the big show. So if you want to call in and be a part of the big show, please feel free. Once again, that number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the evolution of management. For thousands of years, managers have wrestled with the same issues and problems confronting executives today. Around 1100 BC, the Chinese practiced the four management functions: planning, specifying the goals to be achieved, and deciding in advance the appropriate actions needed to achieve those goals; organizing, assembling, and coordinating the human, financial, physical, informational, and other resources needed to achieve goals; leading, stimulating people to be high performers; and controlling, monitoring progress and implementing necessary changes. Between 350 and 400 BC, the Greeks recognized management as a separate art and advocated a scientific approach to work. The Romans decentralized the management of their vast empire before the birth of Christ. During medieval times, the Venetians standardized production through the use of an assembly line, building warehouses and using an inventory system to monitor the contents. But throughout history, most managers operated strictly on a trial and error basis. The challenges of the Industrial Revolution changed that. Shoot. Oops. Changed that. Management emerged as a formal discipline at the turn of the century. The first university programs to offer management and business education, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and the Amos Tuck School at Dartmouth, were founded in the late 19th century. By 1914, 25 business schools existed. Thus, the management profession, as we know it today, is relatively new. This section here, explores the roots of modern management theory. Okay, you caught me. I'm teleprompter reading, but I'm reading right from the blog, but it's my blog and I wrote it, damn it. So there you go. This section explores the roots of modern management theory. Understanding the origins of management thought will help you grasp the underlying context of all the ideas and concepts presented in the sections ahead. Although this section is titled The Evolution of Management, it might be more appropriately called The Revolutions of Management, because it documents the wide swings in management approaches over the last 100 years. Out of the great variety of ideas about how to improve management, parts of each approach have survived and been incorporated into modern perspectives on management. Thus, the legacy of past efforts, triumphs, and failures has become our guide to future management practice. Which brings us to early management concepts and influences. Communication and transportation constraints hindered the growth of earlier businesses. Therefore, improvements in management techniques did not substantially improve performance. However, the Industrial Revolution changed that. As companies grew and became more complex, minor improvements in management tactics produced impressive increases in production quantity and quality. The emergence of economies of scale, reductions in the average cost of a unit of production as the total volume produced increases, drove managers to strive for further growth. The opportunities for mass production created by the Industrial Revolution spawned intense and systematic thought about management problems and issues, particularly efficiency, production processes, and cost savings. This section depicts the evolution of management through the mid to late 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries. This historical perspective is divided into two major sections: classical approaches and contemporary approaches. Many of these approaches developed simultaneously, and they often had a significant impact on one another. Some approaches were a direct reaction to the perceived deficiencies of previous approaches. Others developed as the needs and issues confronting managers changed over the years. All the approaches attempted to explain the real issues facing managers and provide them with tools to solve future problems. Which brings us to classical approaches. The classical period extended from the mid-19th century through the early 1950s. The major approaches that emerged during this were systematic management, scientific management, administrative management, human relations, and bureaucracy. Systematic management. During the 19th century, growth in U.S. business centered on manufacturing. Early writers such as Adam Smith believed the management of these firms was chaotic, and their ideas helped to systemize it. Most organizational tasks are subdivided and performed by specialized labor. However, poor coordination among subordinates and different levels of management cause frequent problems and breakdowns of the manufacturing process. The systematic management approach attempted to build specific procedures and processes into operations to ensure coordination of effort. Systematic management emphasized economical operations, adequate staffing, maintenance of inventories to meet consumer demands, and organizational control. These goals were activated through careful definition of duties and responsibilities, standardized techniques for performing these duties, specific means of gathering, handling, organizing, and analyzing information, cost accounting, wage, and production control systems to facilitate internal coordination and communications. Systematic management emphasized internal operations because managers were concerned primarily with meeting the explosive growth in demand brought about by the Industrial Revolution. In addition, managers were free to focus on internal issues of efficiency, in part because the government did not constrain business practices significantly. Finally, labor was poorly organized. As a result, many managers were oriented more toward things than toward people. Although systematic management did not address all the issues 19th century managers faced, it tried to raise managers' awareness about the most pressing concerns of their job. Scientific management. Systematic management failed to lead to widespread production efficiency. The shortcoming became apparent to a young engineer named Frederick Taylor, who was hired by Midvale Steel Company in 1878. Taylor discovered that production and pay were poor, inefficiency and waste were prevalent, and most companies had tremendous unused potential. He concluded that management decisions were unsystematic and that no research to determine the best means of production existed. In response, Taylor introduced a second approach to management known as scientific management. This approach advocated the application of scientific methods to analyze work and to determine how to complete production tasks efficiently. For example, U.S. Steel's contract with the United Steelworkers of America specified that sand shovelers should move 12.5 shovelfuls per minute. Shovelfuls should average 15 pounds of river sand composed of 5.5% moisture. Taylor identified 4 principles of scientific management. The first principle of scientific manager that Taylor identified was that management should develop a precise scientific approach for each element of one's work to replace general guidelines. The second principle of scientific management that Taylor identified: management should scientifically select, train, teach, and develop each worker so that the right person has the right job. The third principle: management should cooperate with workers to ensure that jobs match plans and principles. The fourth principle: management should ensure an appropriate division of work and responsibility between managers and workers. To implement this approach, Taylor used techniques such as time and motion studies. With this technique, a task was divided into its basic movements, and different motions were timed to determine the most efficient way to complete this task. After the one best way to perform the job was identified, Taylor stressed the importance of hiring and training the proper worker to do that job. Taylor advocated the standardization of tools, the use of instruction cards to help workers, and breaks to eliminate fatigue. Another key element of Taylor's approach was the use of the differential piece rate system. Taylor assumed workers were motivated by receiving money. Therefore, he implemented a pay system in which workers were paid additional wages when they exceeded a standard level of output for each job. Taylor concluded that both workers and management would benefit from such an approach. Scientific management principles were widely embraced. Other properties, other proponents, including Henry Gantt and Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, introduced many refinements and techniques for applying scientific management on the factory floor. One of the most famous examples of the application of scientific management is the factory Henry Ford built to produce the Model T. At the turn of the century, automobiles were a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. They were, turn of last century, or not last. You guys know what I'm trying to say. At the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th century. Okay. All right, they were assembled by craftspeople who put an entire car together at one spot on the factory floor. These workers were not specialized, and Henry Ford believed they wasted time and energy bringing the needed parts to the car. Ford took a revolutionary approach to automobile manufacturing by using scientific management principles. Administrative management. The administrative management approach emphasized the perspective of senior managers within the organization and argued that management was a profession and could be taught. An explicit and broad framework for administrative management emerged in 1916 when Henri Fayol, a French mining engineer and executive, published a book summarizing his management experiences. Fayol identified 5 functions of management. The The 5 functions, which are very similar to the 4 functions discussed in the opening paragraph of this post, this section, include planning. We discussed earlier. These include planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. A host of other executives contributed to the administrative management literature. These writers discussed a broad spectrum of management topics, including the social responsibilities of management, the philosophy of management, clarification of business terms and concepts, and organizational principles. Chester Barnard's and Mary Parker Follett's contributions have become classic works in this area. Barnard, former president of New Jersey Bell Telephone Company, published his landmark book, The Function of the Executive, in 1938. He outlined the role of the senior executive, formulating the purpose of the organization, hiring key individuals, and maintaining organizational communications. Mary Parker Follett's 1942 book, Dynamic Organization, extended Barnard's work by emphasizing that continually changing situations that managers face. 2 of her key contributions, the notion that managers desire flexibility and the differences between motivating groups and individuals, laid the groundwork for the modern contingency approach discussed later in this section. All the writings in the administrative management area emphasized management as a profession, along with fields such as law and medicine. In addition, these authors offered many recommendations based on their personal experiences, which often included managing large corporations. Although these perspectives and recommendations were considered sound, critics noted that they might not work in all settings. Different types of personnel, industry conditions, and technologies may affect the appropriateness of these principles. Human relations. A 4th approach to management, human relations, developed during the 1930s. This approach aimed at understanding how psychological and social processes interact with the work situation to influence performance. Human relations was the first major approach to emphasize informal work relationships and worker satisfaction. This approach owes much to other major schools of thought. For example, many of the ideas of the Gilbreths, scientific management, and Barnard and Follett, administrative management, influenced the development of human relations from 1930 to 1955. In fact, human relations emerged from a research project that began as a scientific management study. Western Electric Company, a manufacturer of communications equipment, hired a team of Harvard researchers led by Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger. They were to investigate the influence of physical working conditions on worker productivity and efficiency in one of the company's factories outside Chicago. This research project, known as the Hawthorne Studies, provided some of the most interesting and controversial results in the history of management. The Hawthorne Studies were a series of experiments conducted from 1924 and 1932. During the first stage of the project, the illumination experiments, various working conditions, particularly the lighting in the factory, were altered to determine the effects of those changes on productivity. The researchers found no systematic relationship between the factory lighting and production levels. In some cases, productivity continued to increase even when the illumination was reduced to the level of moonlight. The researchers concluded that the workers performed and reacted differently because the researchers were observing them. This reaction is known as the Hawthorne effect. This conclusion led the researchers to believe productivity may be affected more by psychological and social factors than by physical or objective influences. With this thought in mind, they initiated the other 4 stages of the project. During these stages, the researchers performed various work group experiments and had extensive interviews with employees. Mayo and his team eventually concluded that productivity and employee behavior were influenced by the informal work group. Anyway, moving on. Human relations proponents argued that managers should stress primarily employee welfare, motivation, and communication. They believed social needs had precedence over economic needs. Therefore, management must gain the cooperation of the group and promote job satisfaction and group norms consistent with the goals of the organization. Another noted contributor to the field of human relations was Abraham Maslow. In 1943, Maslow suggested that humans have 5 levels of needs. The most basic needs are the physical needs for food, water, and shelter. The most advanced need is for self-actualization or personal fulfillment. Maslow argued that people try to satisfy their lower level needs and then progress upward to the higher level needs. Managers can facilitate this process and achieve organizational goals by removing obstacles and encouraging behaviors that satisfy people's needs and organizational goals simultaneously. Although the human relations approach generated research into leadership, job attitudes, and group dynamics, it drew heavy criticism. Critics believe that one result of human relations, a belief that a happy worker was a productive worker, was too simplistic. While scientific management overemphasized the economic and formal aspects of the workplace, human relations ignored the more rational side of the worker and the important characteristics of the formal organization. However, human relations was a significant step in the development of management thought because it prompted managers and researchers to consider the psychological and social factors that influence performance. Bureaucracy. Max Weber, a German sociologist, lawyer, and social historian, showed how management itself could be more efficient and consistent in his book, The Theory of Social and Economic Organization. The ideal model for management, according to Weber, is the bureaucracy approach. Weber believed bureaucratic structures can eliminate the variability that results when managers in the same organization have different skills, experiences, and goals. Weber advocated that the jobs themselves be standardized so that personal changes would not disrupt the organization. He emphasized a structured, formal network of relationships among specialized positions in an organization. Rules and regulations standardized behavior, and authority resides in positions rather than in individuals. As a result, the organization need not rely on a particular individual, but will realize efficiency and success by following the rules in a routine and unbiased manner. According to Weber, bureaucracies are especially important because they allow large organizations to perform the many routine activities necessary for their survival. Also, bureaucratic positions foster specialized skills, eliminating many subjective judgments by managers. In addition, if the rules and controls are established properly, bureaucracies should be unbiased in their treatment of people, both customers and employees. Many organizations today are bureaucratic. Bureaucracy can be efficient and productive. However, bureaucracy is not the appropriate model for every organization. Organizations or departments that need rapid decision making and flexibility may suffer under a bureaucratic approach. Some people may not perform their best with excessive bureaucratic rules and procedures. Other shortcomings stem from a faulty execution of bureaucratic principles rather than from the approach itself. Too much authority may be vested in too few people. The procedure may become the ends rather than the means of managers, or managers may ignore appropriate rules and regulations. Finally, one advantage of a bureaucracy, its permanence, can also be a problem. Once a bureaucracy is established, dismantling it is very difficult. Contemporary approaches. The contemporary approaches to management include quantitative management, organizational behavior, systems theory, and the contingency perspective. Contemporary approaches have developed at various times since World War II, and they continue to represent the cornerstones of modern management thought. Quantitative management. Although Taylor introduced the use of science as a management tool early in the 20th century, most organizations did not adopt the use of quantitative techniques for management problems until the 1940s and 1950s. During World War II, military planners began to apply mathematical techniques to defense and logistic problems. After the war, private corporations began assembling teams of quantitative experts to tackle many of the complex issues confronting large organizations. This approach, referred to as quantitative management, emphasizes the application of quantitative analysis to management decisions and problems. Quantitative management helps a manager make a decision by developing formal mathematical models of the problem. Computers have facilitated the development of specific quantitative methods. These include such techniques as statistical decision theory, linear programming, queuing theory, simulation, forecasting, inventory modeling, network modeling, and break-even analysis. Organizations apply these techniques in many areas, including production, quality control, marketing, human resources, finance, distribution, planning, and research and development. Despite the promise quantitative management holds, managers do not rely on these methods as the primary approach to decision making. Typically, they use these techniques as a supplement or tool in the decision process. Many managers will use results that are consistent with their experience, intuition, and judgment, but they will reject results that contradict their beliefs. Also, managers may use the process to compare alternatives and eliminate weaker options. Several explanations account for the limited use of quantitative management. Many managers have not been trained in using these techniques. Also, many aspects of a management decision cannot be expressed through mathematical symbols and formulas. Finally, many of the decisions managers face are non-routine and unpredictable. Organizational behavior. During the 1950s, a transition took place in the human relations approach. Scholars began to recognize that worker productivity and organizational success are based on more than the satisfaction of economic or social needs. The revised perspective known as behavior studies and identifies management activities that promote employee effectiveness through an understanding of the complex nature of individual, group, and organizational processes. Organizational behavior draws from a variety of disciplines, including psychology and sociology, to explain the behavior of people on the job. During the 1960s, organizational behaviorists heavily influenced the field of management. Douglas McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y marked the transition from human relations. According to McGregor, Theory X managers assume workers are lazy and irresponsible and require constant supervision and external motivation to achieve organizational goals. Theory Y managers assume employees want to work and can direct and control themselves. McGregor advocated a Theory Y perspective, suggesting that managers who encourage participation and allow opportunities for individual challenge and initiative would achieve superior performance. Other major organizational behaviorists include Chris Argyris, who recommended greater autonomy and better jobs for workers, and Rensis Likart, who stressed the value of participative management. Through the years, organizational behavior has consistently emphasized development of the organization's human resources to achieve individual and organizational goals. Like other approaches, it has been criticized for its limited perspective, although more recent contributions have a broader and more situational viewpoint. In the past few years, many of the primary issues addressed by organizational behavior have experienced a rebirth with a greater interest in leadership, employee involvement, and self-management. Systems theory. The classical approaches as a whole were criticized because they, 1, ignored the relationship between the organization and its external environment, and 2, usually stressed what aspect of the organization or its employees at the expense of other considerations. In response to these criticisms, management scholars during the 1950s stepped back from the details of the organization to attempt to understand it as a whole system. These efforts were based on a general scientific approach called systems theory. An organization is a managed system that transforms inputs, raw materials, people, and other resources into outputs. The goods and services that comprise its products. Contingency perspective. Building on systems theory ideas, the contingency perspective refutes universal principles of management by stating that a variety of factors, both internal and external to the firm, may affect the organization's performance. Thus, there is no one best way to manage and organize because circumstances vary. For example, a universal strategy of offering low-cost products would not succeed in a market that is not cost-conscious. Situational characteristics are called contingencies. Understanding contingencies helps a manager know which set of circumstances dictate which management actions. You will learn the recommendations for the major contingencies throughout this analysis. The contingencies include 1. Circumstances in the organization's external environment. 2. The internal strengths and weaknesses of the organization. 3. The values, goals, skills, and attitudes of managers and workers in the organization. 4. The types of tasks, resources, and technologies the organization uses. With an eye to these contingencies, a manager may categorize the situation and then choose the proper competitive strategy, organization structure, or management process for the circumstances. Researchers continue to identify key contingency variables and their effect on management issues. As you read the topics covered in each part of this analysis, you will notice the similarities and differences among management situations and the appropriate responses. This perspective should represent a cornerstone of your approach to management. Many of the things you will learn about throughout this analysis apply a contingency perspective. Contemporary approaches. All of these historical perspectives have left legacies that affect contemporary management thought and practice. Their undercurrents continue to flow, even as the context and the specifics change. But new approaches to management continue to appear and contribute to an ever-changing management profession. The remaining sections report on these dynamic contemporary perspectives. For example, the 1980s brought a new gospel called quality management, new perspectives on competition and on business strategy, a focus on excellence, and a renewed interest in people, including both employees and customers. The 1990s brought theories and practices such as learning organization, lean manufacturing, knowledge management, and the characteristics of corporate cultures that help to build great and enduring companies. The rest of this analysis, and perhaps the rest of your career, will be spent enacting the management functions, the drivers of competitive advantage, the enduring aspect of the historical perspectives, and the continually evolving contemporary perspectives on the successful practices of management. Moving on. Back in the day with my Uncle Jed, kept a lot of moonshine out in the shed. Taught me how to drink, how to be real proud of my hillbilly ways and my outlaw style. Going straight to hell. Nothing slowing me down. Going, all right. The external environment, ladies and gentlemen. Besides problems of their own making, many firms are beset by government fees and restrictions, factors of the external environment that affect their ability to compete effectively. The next couple of sections discuss how pressures from outside organizations create the external context in which organizations operate. Organizations are open systems that are affected by and in turn affect their external environments. By external environment, I mean all relevant forces outside the organization's boundaries. By relevant, I mean factors to which managers must pay attention to help their organizations compete effectively and survive. Many of these factors are uncontrollable. Companies large and small are buffeted or battered by recession, government interference, competitors' actions, and so forth. But their lack of control does not mean that managers can ignore such forces, use them as excuses for poor performance, and try to just get by. Managers must stay abreast of external developments and react accordingly. Moreover, as we will discuss later, it sometimes is possible to influence components of the external environment. We will examine ways in which organizations can do just that. The firm exists in its competitive environment, which is composed of the firm and competitors, suppliers, customers, new entrants, and substitute. At the more general level is the macro environment, which includes legal, political, economic, technological, demographic, and social and natural factors that generally affect all organizations. The macro environment. All organizations operate in a macro environment, which is defined by the most general elements in the external environment that potentially can influence strategic decisions. Although a top executive team may have unique internal strengths and ideas about its goals, it must consider external factors before taking action. Laws and regulations. U.S. government policies both impose strategic constraints and provide opportunities. The government can affect business opportunities through tax laws, economic policies, and international trade rulings. An example of restraint on business action is the U.S. government standards regarding bribery. In some countries, bribes and kickbacks are common and expected ways of doing business. But for U.S. firms, these are illegal practices. Indeed, some U.S. businesses have been fined for using bribery when competing internationally. Regulators are specific government organizations in a firm's more immediate task environment. Regulatory agencies such as the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP, and the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, all have the power to investigate company practices and take legal action to ensure compliance with the laws. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, regulates U.S. financial markets, and the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, can prevent a company from selling an unsafe or an effective product to the public, or an ineffective product to the public. Publicly traded pharmaceutical firms, for example, face regulations both from the FDA and the SEC. The economy. Although most Americans are used to thinking in terms of the U.S. economy, the economic environment is created by complex interconnections among the economies of different countries. Wall Street investment analysts begin their workday thinking not just about what the Dow Jones did yesterday, but also about how the London and Tokyo exchanges did overnight. Growth and recessions occur worldwide as well as domestically. The economic environment dramatically affects companies' ability to function effectively and influences their strategic choices. Interest and inflation, interest and inflation rates affect the availability and cost of capital, the ability to expand prices, costs, and consumer demand for products. Unemployment rates affect labor availability and the wages the firm must pay, as well as product demand. Economic conditions change over time and are difficult to predict. Bull and bear markets come and go. Periods of dramatic growth may be followed by a recession. Every trend undoubtedly will end, but when? Even when times seem good, budget deficits or other considerations create concern about the future. Technology. Today, a company cannot succeed without incorporating into its strategy the astonishing technologies that exist and continue to evolve. Technological advances create new products, advanced production techniques, and better ways of communicating. In addition, as technology evolves, new industries, markets, and competitive niches develop. For example, the advent of computers created a huge industry. Early entrants into biotechnology are trying to establish dominant positions, while later entrants work on technological advances that will give them a competitive niche. New technologies also provide new production techniques. In manufacturing, sophisticated robots perform jobs without suffering fatigue, requiring vacations or weekends off, or demanding wage increases. Until the U.S. steel industry began modernizing its plants, its productivity lagged far behind that of the technologically superior Japanese plants. New technologies also provide new ways to manage and communicate. Computerized Management Information Systems, MIS, make information available when needed. Computers monitor productivity and note performance deficiencies. Telecommunications allow conferences to take place without requiring people to travel to the same location. Strategies developed around the cutting edge of technological advances create a competitive advantage. Strategies that ignore or lag behind competitors in considering technology lead to obsolescence and extinction. Demographics. Demographics are measures of various characteristics of the people comprising groups or other social units, work groups, organizations, countries, markets, and societies can be described statistically by referring to their members' age, gender, family size, income, education, occupation, and so forth. Companies must consider workforce demographics in formulating their human resources strategies. Population growth influences the size and composition of the labor force. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. labor force, the number of people working or looking for work, is projected to reach 163.8 million in 2024. The labor force is anticipated to grow by 7.9 million, reflecting an average annual growth rate of 0.5% over the 2014 to 2024 period. The projected labor force growth over the 2014 to 2024 period will be affected by the aging of the baby boom generation. those born between 1946 and 1964. In 2014, the baby boomers were 50 to 68 years old. The leading edge of the baby boomers, those born in 1946, became eligible for early Social Security benefits at age 62 in 2008 and reached full retirement age at 66 in 2012. In 2024, the baby boom cohort will be ages 60 to 78, and a large number will already have exited the labor force. A review of the 2014 to 2024 projected labor force data reveals that certain demographic groups are projected to grow more rapidly than others. Women are expected to see their numbers in the labor force grow more slowly than in 2004 to 2014, but their growth rate will still be faster than that of men. As a result, the share of women in the labor force is projected to increase from 46.8% in 2014 to 47.2% in 2024. Race and ethnicity groups are projected to continue to show widely different labor force growth rates because of their divergent rates of population growth. Hispanics, Asians, and the all other groups racial category are projected to increase their numbers in the labor force most rapidly. By 2024, Hispanics are projected to be nearly 1/5 of the labor force as a result of the fastest population growth of all the race and ethnicity groups. Despite a declining annual growth and a declining share of the workforce, white non-Hispanics still make up about 60% of the labor force in 2024. A more diverse workforce has its advantages, but managers have to make certain they provide equality for women and minorities with respect to employment, advancement opportunities, and compensation. Strategic plans must be made for recruiting, retaining, training, motivating, and effectively utilizing people of diverse demographic backgrounds with the skills needed to achieve the company's mission. Social issues and the natural environment. Societal trends regarding how people think and behave have major implications for management of the labor force. Corporate social actions and strategic decisions about products and markets. During the 1980s and 1990s, women in the workforce often chose to delay having children as they focused on their careers. But today, more working women are having children and then returning to the workforce. As a result, companies have introduced more supportive policies, including family leave, flexible working hours, and child care assistance. Many firms also extend these benefits to all employees or allow them to design their own benefits packages. Where they can choose from a menu of available benefits that suit their individual situations. Domestic partners, whether they are in a marital relationship or not, also are covered by many employee benefit programs. Firms provide these benefits as a way of increasing a source of competitive advantage and experienced workforce. All right, ladies and gents, end of the big show. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, don't take any wooden nickels, everybody.